Welcome to Maps and Meta-Analysis.
Looking at California cities. Hi, I'm Darvesh
And I'm Justin Hurst, and this is Facts in Folsom,
a meta-analysis. All right. Hey guys, so this week there was a city council meeting, so we're just going to go over the contents of the city council meeting. There was a lot that was covered, but the bulk of it was one particular issue, which we're going to kind of dive deep into. So we'll still talk about the other topics that were addressed there, but we won't spend as much time on it because we really want to spend time on the last item. And without spoiling it too much, we'll kind of clarify it when we get there. The setup is a bit confusing. It was confusing for us to read it on the agenda. So we'll kind of break down what the issue was, who the different parties are, what their arguments are, and try to steelman each person as best as possible. But there were about like a dozen or so different arguments, like somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And so we might not cover everyone's points, kind of at 100%, but we'll try to give you the gist of what we took away in kind of the most like charitable version that we can think of.
Yeah, and this city council meeting also had the most engagement that we've seen so far from members of the public, and we'll generally talk about what was said without like delving into who said what and like identifying who was speaking.
Yeah, exactly, and we'll try to. I mean, obviously for the council members, we'll have to address that to some extent, but we also don't want this to be like, I don't know, just indicative of their beliefs overall, right? Like this is obviously a case by case basis. Maybe they would have, thought differently were this like a different issue altogether. So yeah, we'll clarify that when we get there.
And one last point, maybe this is something I'll say at the end too, but like we actually would hope to be able to use this podcast as a way for them to flush out their thinking. So hopefully one of the upcoming episodes will be from these presenters.
Yeah, because I think oftentimes we tend to, not we specifically, but I think people tend to break apart into these tribes and say, hey, my tribe is good because of this, and the other tribe is not good because they stand for what I oppose. And what we really want to do is have the best version of each person's argument and ultimately come to a consensus that we all sort of agree on. And we think that local politics is a great place to do this. So without any further ado, we'll jump into the topics. So first there was a roll call. Then there was actually a section for public comment that didn't relate to this, but this was just sort of the kind of standard section of the city council meeting where people are allowed to give a presentation on pretty much anything. So one of the things that was discussed was the HEART winter program ending. So if you guys remember from a previous episode, the HEART program is basically like a homelessness advocacy and sort of outreach group. And during the winter time, so I think somewhere around like mid-December to around end of March, they basically run a winter shelter where people who are unhoused can come there, like, stay overnight, and they also give access to kind of long-term housing solutions, sobriety programs, and things like that. So the idea is to give people a safe space to transition from that spectrum of completely unhoused to ideally permanently housed. And yeah, it was basically they just noted some of the successes that were there recently. It was a very stormy season in California, so this is a much needed program overall. And yeah, then we got a short presentation from Jennifer Lane. It was part of the River District Ad Hoc Committee. So they mentioned, they actually talked a bit more about a program called Zardico, which we mentioned in, I believe, episode 2. And we were wondering about some of the details there. And so we got a bit more insight into that. Basically, the idea is it would track kind of a radius around Folsom, and it would distinguish between residents of Folsom as well as like visitors, and with the idea being that, okay, if we know where visitors are shopping and spending their money versus where residents are spending their money, we can kind of optimize things differently for tourism versus the benefit of the local residents. Then we got a presentation from Ethan Walker. So I believe he was a high school student and he was doing a project as part of a SMUD competition, and he mentioned this law SB 54, which aims to reduce plastic pollution by making bags recyclable and compostable. And I think the goal was something like an 85% reduction. I forget what the exact time frame was, but I think this idea of sort of asymptotically getting to zero of these like single-use plastics. So he gave a few statistics about that. Do you want to go over the back half of this first section?
So after that high school student presented, who was from Vista, where we both went, we had a presentation from Ted Court, which stood for Tourism and Economic Development. So this is a affiliated with the chamber. And they talked about the digitized economic development zones, as well as that's where those article data came up. That was we actually got to see an example of what that would look like. How they coded it. We're hoping that this can be something that we think about, not necessarily duplicating, but like complementing with Folsom Maps.
Yeah, exactly. And we feel that it could be complementary because I think in one case this is almost like a top-down thing. You're getting it from the businesses, and so that might have its own sort of skew. Whereas if you get it at a grassroots level from residents opting in, even if there's less data, it tends to be more high quality. So think of maybe something like Reddit, right? Or like Reddit tends to have a lot of high quality information because people are opting into those conversations and actively participating. Whereas maybe just like a comment section on sort of like a passive post on other social media might garner not as much engagement in a sort of like deeper sense.
They also introduced one of the things on their purview is they have a place, I want to say it's called the Granite School, which has been essentially used as an incubator for the city of Folsom, which then there was a presentation from Baconics, is that how you pronounce it?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, which is one of those startups, which is a platform to make the invention of different, like basically if you want to be an inventor, something that be streamlined and simplified for the average person in a drag and drop process. And they wanted to plug it and mention that they're a success story and hopefully help to attract more people to use this startup in the city.
Yeah, and one of the things that they mentioned was they actually hired someone out of Folsom Lake College, which is like our local community college. They also mentioned that they were going to start an internship program for schools around the area. So I think their argument was that if you nurture these seeds locally, then they will sort of bloom and aid in the local economy, and so it would just be like a net positive for everyone.
Yeah. Next was the consent calendar, which was not just unilaterally passed this time. There were a couple of different things that were discussed. One of them being there was a sewer lift project, which got some discussion at the request of YK council member, because it only received one bid in the process. So there was definitely a back and forth between the council and some of the representatives of the city talking about that bidding process and why it may or may not be advantageous to go through another bidding process. So there was a proposal to formally reject the bid, which failed at the city council vote. And then after that, there was, what was this on the special tax? Was that as another consent calendar item?
Yeah, it was. I honestly didn't understand it that much. It was, basically there was an item on the consent calendar for I think this tax actually had been discussed before. It was like a property tax that was set to increase at a rate of somewhere between like 2 and 4% per year. Basically like at 2% but no more than 4% per year, and it was tied to CPI. That's the Consumer Price Index, which is a canonical gauge for inflation on like a year-to-year and even a month-to-month basis. And so I believe there was something about I didn't quite understand the voting process because there was this formality of announcing an election, and then the election basically concluded like immediately afterwards. And so we thought that there would be 0 votes yes, 0 votes no, and so then maybe the council would take over the decision or something. But it turns out there were 32 votes cast, and we didn't really understand like where those votes came from. We have some hypotheses, but I don't want to speculate too much. So yeah, that was just kind of a weird anomaly, and if we find out more, we'll definitely fill you guys in. But it didn't seem like a particularly contentious thing. It just seemed like one of those, I mean, probably why it was on the consent calendar. Basically, it was just one of those things where it's kind of the normal functioning of a new development. Oh, and for context, this was related to Folsom Ranch, which is the kind of newest area of Folsom that's being built out on like a residential level. So this is like a tax on basically.
I think it was a facilities tax.
Yeah, or something like that. Basically, it would fund facilities that are obviously like related to that new development.
And whether or not that was, covering the whole of Folsom Ranch residents versus some subset of the population, maybe even businesses, that wasn't necessarily clear. So it was definitely a little bit confusing, especially with the way that it was breezed through in such a way that was uncontroversial, I get the sense that it doesn't really affect all the residents, but it's hard to say either way.
Yeah, also, one thing I found somewhat paradoxical about it was the fact that you are proactively levying this tax on an area that may or may not have residents currently living there. So it felt, just to me, a bit undemocratic because, you know, who else is going to raise their voice and, you know, decide to... I mean, some people might be good Samaritans, but, you know, it feels remarkably unrepresentative. You know, how like, once those people buy their homes, like, they had no say in whether or not that tax was levied. And maybe they would have a different opinion, and maybe they would be okay with the risks or, I don't know, lack of facilities, or maybe they would want to find some other way to fund those facilities. So that's one part that kind of struck me, and, you know, I wonder if this has happened in Folsom throughout. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily seem like an easy issue to resolve, right? Like, you can't just push this issue, you know, out into the future. So far, you have to be kind of proactive about these things in order to, you know, get the necessary funds to build the facilities and maintain them. So, you know, obviously there's no silver bullet here, but I just thought that was an interesting conundrum that wasn't really addressed.
And I personally would have liked to see a little bit more on what the revenue is going to be going to specifically, to get a sense of, you know, why now, answering that question, as well as what they're expecting to get out of this tax, like in terms of amounts versus how much they're going to need in the long run.
Yeah, that would be great to know. But yeah, do you want to move on to the...
Yeah, sure. So the next item was actually relatively quick. It was the proposed historic Folsom Property and Business Improvement District. I, going into this, thought it was a reauthorization of an existing district, but I think,
that's kind of the way it was phrased a bit, which is like, oh, this has been an ongoing partnership. And so,
that they gave a presentation basically showing all the different events that they've done in the past, as well as like how they've been expanding events into the future and what their plans are. So even if it is like an authorization in a more formal way or a reauthorization, it was very uncontroversial. The City Council definitely agreed with it. They showed a lot of value in the historic district, and I think that has very much been a priority throughout all these different City Council meetings. So it was definitely something that was, I would say, like a high point for the evening, where it felt like everyone in the city could like rally behind it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll let you talk about the next one.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Is it number 13 or 12? 12, okay.
No.
I think, honestly, yeah, I for some reason I thought this item got sort of lumped in to the following item.
Yeah.
But I'll basically just read out the title. So it was Housing Element Program H2, Additional Housing Capacity Build-Out Assumptions, Analysis and Recommendations. Okay, this is kind of jogging my memory now. So basically there is a, due to the kind of newest set of housing regulations passed by the state of California, every city basically has a target for the amount of additional housing it needs to build out, based on a variety of factors, you know, such as like its location, its current population, the rate of growth, all of these sorts of things. And you're basically given a number by the state, and it is the city's responsibility to figure out how to meet that quota, and or exceed it if they so choose. And so, but the idea being that, okay, we need to build more housing as a state, but we also want to give local municipalities the flexibility to choose when and where and how they decide to build this extra capacity in a way that reflects the interests of the residents that are currently there. However, the caveat to this, right, because you might be saying like, okay, well, what if I just don't do it? Which is actually an argument that Councilmember Kozlowski was sort of alluding to, which is basically that, hey, this is this is just a formalism, right? Like how is California possibly going to go into every city and check that they're building all of the housing that they intend to build, things like that. And so as far as I understand it, the mechanism of accountability, or the primary mechanism of accountability that the state of California has, is that if a municipality does not meet this quota, which has actually happened up till now, I believe some cities in Southern California have like breached this, and there've been some interesting kind of like YIMBY events that have happened.
I think the Bay Area as well.
Yes, yeah. I believe. Don't quote me on this. Maybe Oakland, I want to say.
I don't recall.
Okay,
specifically.
Anyway. But yeah, so yeah, I don't want to go down that route. But basically, the idea is that if you don't meet this quota or exceed it, obviously, then if a new developer proposes a plan that has a sufficient amount of low-income housing, then their then the state of California basically approves their plans and kind of supersedes the local government. Basically, any plan that meets these criteria gets approved.
Yeah.
And so you could imagine, kind of developers would be, more than delighted to basically wait for such an opportunity where the city kind of hands them the keys to build whatever they want as long as they meet these criteria, which I don't believe are that strict. In terms of like the market rate affordability. It's not like the whole complex has to be, market rate or something like that. It's like, it's definitely in the double-digit percentages, so it's not like trivial. I don't know the exact percentage, but it seemed like that was the least egregious part from the developer's point of view.
Well, I will say another way to think about this conceptually is it very much flips the burden of proof on its head, where it used to be to get a housing project built, you put the burden of proof on the developer to prove that you meet all these standards, whereas now it's almost an automatic approval unless it's proven that they do not meet the standards.
Exactly.
So that's why it's really meant to speed up the housing development process, specifically for low-income affordable housing.
Yeah, and to clarify, this is only if your housing element does not meet the criteria. And a housing element is supposed to be 5-10 years in advance. So it's not like this is happening on like a year-to-year basis and you just forget to submit a form and you don't do this. Like this is a very intentional thing that cities would choose not to do. It's not like they can avoid this. And these housing elements are meant to be submitted even prior to this bill. So it's not like there's a new bureaucratic procedure or anything like that. And so, some things I took note about were there's actually this no net loss requirement, which I found kind of interesting. So the basic idea here is that in some places, like let's say San Francisco, if you want to build new housing, there aren't a lot of brand new empty lots available. So you're not sort of like linearly adding capacity. You're basically taking some housing offline in order to build more housing in the future. And so this no net loss requirement basically requires that a city maintain a current, basically the same level of housing that it started with while it's building new housing, which is, sort of a concession almost to the local government, because then it means they can stagger out a lot of the projects. And it's also good for residents. It means that the housing supply isn't acutely dipping before then ballooning, and kind of avoids these whiplash situations.
Can you speak to some of the zones that they identified? In this plan?
Yeah, totally. So they identified a few key areas. So they mentioned the East Bidwell corridor, and then the areas around the Glen and Iron Point station, the light rail station, which runs from Folsom, all the way to downtown Sacramento. They also mentioned Folsom Town Center and the Folsom Plain area, which I assume is like Folsom Ranch and the newer.
Yeah, Folsom Plain I think encompasses Folsom Ranch as well as what hasn't been built yet.
Ah, gotcha. Okay, yeah. The two most exciting points for me here, I won't get into like all the areas, but they mentioned some points in the East Bidwell corridor, for example, where the sewage and electrical infrastructure, is not really meant to accommodate the extra increase in residents. So that's going to be an extra cost that's going to go into making that a mixed-use zoning or even like a more dense residential zoning. But I thought the idea of building around the Iron Point and Glen station was actually like really, really good. Something I was looking forward to. I think the SAC-RT is actually really good in that it is one of the lowest cost per mile light rail systems that has been deployed in the U.S. I think it was, and that's not like a large number, but I think it was like 20 million per mile, which is not that much in the grand scheme of things. I believe Seattle spent over $100 million per mile.
Oh wow!
So so the variance can be quite a bit. And I think they did it in a pretty sensible way. I mean, I would have liked to see some stuff different, but I think the biggest gripe I have with SAC-RT personally is that the land use around the stations is like atrocious. It's like all like parking lots. It's like never really residential. You're like never within walking distance from a station to like any kind of amenities, except in the very heart of downtown. And even then, it's a lot of sort of offices and corporate buildings and things like that, which is less and less relevant post COVID and the kind of work from home trend. So this is a great move, I think, on Folsom's part, even to just connect the kind of light rail corridor within Folsom. There's like 3 stations within Folsom. So there's Iron Point, there's Glen, and then there's Sutter Street. So even just connecting those areas, I think, would be fantastic. I think that would provide residents a lot of cool things to do and a lot of good housing options. I think I already touched on the Kozlowski point. I touched on the water sewage point.
I think that was most of the presentation, which dovetailed really well into the main agenda item, which is next.
Yeah. So do you want to tee it off?
Sure, yeah. So now setting up the understanding, one, that there's this law which is It's called the Housing Accountability Act, which basically was passed in 2022, where the state flipped the burden of proof to be very much on the community to disincentivize or prove that a development project is something that would not benefit the city. So this agenda item itself, with that context, with the presentation that was just given, is a very specific low-income project that is right across from Folsom Prison on Natoma. And it was specifically at the point where there was an appeal by a community member who lived in a nearby community. It was an appeal to the decision of the Planning Commission to go with. I'm just going to read the agenda item because it's very complicated, and then we'll try to break it down.
Yeah, we'll kind of decompose it because we were trying to sit there in like real time, like decomposing this. So yeah.
Hopefully we can help alleviate some of your confusion because it took us a while. So the full name of the agenda item is Appeal by Catherine Gray of Decisions by the Planning Commission adopting a mitigated negative declaration and mitigation monitoring and reporting program and approving a conditional use permit, planned development permit, and density bonus for development of the 136 unit vintage senior apartments project, with the project number that I won't read, located at 103 East Natoma Street.
So do you mind if I like start to
Yeah,
break down some of those
please
terms,
do.
and then you can just pick up where I left off?
Yeah, absolutely.
So basically, there's this developer, and they're trying to build an apartment complex for seniors. There was some debate on like what the minimum age was. I believe it was 55.
Yeah,
but,
it was 55.
Okay, but that seemed like unclear at first. So, but yeah, okay, I guess it was resolved to 55.
And that goes with all residents. You can't just be a 55-year-old who's a primary person on the lease and then have like your younger partner.
Yeah, this was actually specifically brought up, so it would violate the lease agreements if that were to occur. So basically, there's a developer. They're trying to build a vintage senior apartment, which is like the name of the apartment complex, and the lot that they were planning to build on was actually designated or zoned as a business and professional lot. However, the city has what's called a conditional use permit, and the conditional use permit allows the city council to let a developer develop residences or a residential structure on what is otherwise zoned as a business or professional zoned lot. Right, so that's where this conditional use permit comes from. This requires the city council approval. They also get some extra bonuses for building high density housing, hence the density bonus. There's one other thing I believe. Oh, the planned development permit. So I think this is like a standard permit. This is like, hey, we're gonna level the ground. We're going to install these structures. We're going to lay a foundation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's pretty normal. But the conditional use permit, that's like the kind of peculiar part. So then there was a neighbor on a street called like Cimarron, which is basically just like right behind where the apartment complexes would be built. And they submitted what was called I believe it was like a mitigated.
Oh, no. So here, I'll take this one.
Okay.
They appealed a decision by the Planning Commission because as part of the approval process, this project had to go through the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission voted to adopt the mitigated negative declaration and mitigation monitoring and reporting program while also approving the conditional use permit. And basically what that means is they just found that, oh, well, this isn't something that like is of such a concern that it would go against that that law that California passed called the Housing Accountability Act. So it was basically this whole appeal was saying, oh, well, the Planning Commission erred in saying that this met the requirements for that act.
Yeah. So basically, to clarify what this document says, basically this document is things like, how this will impact traffic or noise or the safety of nearby residents, right? Can the proposed changes to the road infrastructure, accommodate these changes? Will there be public transit, and sort of so on and so forth? Is there sufficient like sewage infrastructure, all these kind of things, environmental impacts of building a development there? And so I think the conclusion from the developer's report and what was, I guess, originally agreed upon was that there is, a very minimal impact to the surrounding area. And so, with that kind of caveat that we expect there to be a minimal impact, let's move forward with the project. And so, exactly. This is what this is what Catherine Gray, the appellant, was actually appealing. And she, actually, do you want to summarize maybe like her arguments, like which aspects that she felt like violated that mitigating use declaration?
So there were, I think, 5 points that were initially presented in the appeal, but only a couple of them were actually dove into. And I will also, before I get into the points, mention that Catherine Gray was clearly doing this on behalf of a greater community, because there was a lot of different people there, and some that were alternating speaking even during the initial presentation.
Yeah.
And some of the points relating to safety. So, for example, there was an argument that there was no safe way for people to cross the road. There was an argument that the traffic is already bad, and increasing the traffic with this housing development will lead to, basically car accidents and potentially people getting run over, that sort of thing. So safety was very much a core interest. There was also some concern about the environmental impact. For example, there's a lot of oak trees currently on the lot. There's also some degree of ecology where there's a lot of birds, there's squirrels.
Yeah, surprisingly, the arborist came up again. It was like, it was not even just this time. It was like 2 or 3 times where like the arborist came up. So that's it's kind of interesting.
That being said, and we'll get into it a little bit later, but not all of the trees. It's not like this entire area will be leveled for the sake of this affordable housing unit. That being said, a significant portion will be, because they'll need to be. I think it's a 3-story building that they're building, plus parking lots and all the facilities needed. So those were a couple of the big points. Were there any other ones that you want to talk about?
I don't know. I guess the arguments sort of blended into one another. I felt like her core arguments were kind of reiterated by other members of the community. So it definitely didn't feel like she had like some very esoteric argument that didn't really jive with people. It seemed like people were very much in support of the points that she was making. If I have to remember off the top of my head, I think some of the core points were that because this is a conditional use permit, meaning that the zoning is actually not intended for residential, which she is correct about, that the city council should not award this conditional permit because it was zoned as business professional for a good reason. And she cites that basically just down the street, that is almost exclusively commercially and kind of business professionally zoned, right? There's like there's like lawyers' offices, dentist offices, like jewelers, all these other sorts of businesses. And I think the argument is that, okay, well, that lot was designated as business professional because of that. So this would be kind of an overreach to almost like rezone it without actually having to rezone it. I felt like that was a pretty salient argument. I remember that, there were like maybe 1 or 2 others that she made.
Some of the ones that really weren't dove into as much was that the initial study and mitigated negative declaration didn't fully evaluate, disclose, and like effectively say that there wouldn't be much of an impact to the environment. That was kind of a point that was just raised and left in favor of talking about the safety as the overarching theme. There was also a discussion that the project wasn't feasible, although it didn't really seem like there was much really follow-up on that.
I think the argument there was that in order to accommodate the extra environmental and safety requirements would basically make the project completely unaffordable. And so then you would be, I think the idea is that if it's unaffordable, the project will never get built, and then Folsom just awarded this permit for something that will not like recoup any money for the city.
And a specific example of why it could potentially be infeasible is they also did provide some images of the site and showed that, for example, on the side of the Natoma Street where the project will be built, there's something of a steep grade there where in order to meet some of the restrictions that the city put on this deal, they would have to effectively like raise the land as well as building sidewalks out to make it like safer along the side of the road, which naturally, if you're having to do something this big and not already on a flat surface, is going to increase your costs.
I think that was it for her arguments, but I felt like again, like Jennifer's arguments blended quite seamlessly into the other people that came up to speak. So
Catherine?
Oh, Catherine, sorry, my bad. Sorry, I was thinking of Jennifer, who was one of the people that spoke earlier.
There was a lot of people.
Apologies for that. Catherine Gray is the name of the appellant. That was also the first time I heard the word appellant so much.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, this is very much it felt like a legal case in City Hall.
It really did.
Maybe that's part of the reason why we're so confused, because the language is also so technical.
But I understand it in retrospect why it was phrased like that specifically. But yeah, it definitely doesn't make it any easier.
So then, after they presented their case, the developer came up to present their case, and they showed that they had done all the initial studies that were required legally, that showed the impact of traffic. They didn't find that there was going to be a significant impact to that point. They had a specific idea that was built into the process for a separate gate, and I guess this was a suggestion during the process when they were going through the planning commission, for only ambulances and garbage. So that way there's only really one way in or out for residents, and that is going to be at the same signal where the Folsom Prison entrance currently is. They also showed that they were making efforts to preserve some of the local landscape and ecology. For example, there was a very big common area in the middle where they preserved a lot of the trees and nature. They made an argument that they were going to facilitate the creation of sidewalks to connect it and make it safe for pedestrians to one, cross over into other parts of the community, that neighborhood, but also connect it to an underpass that goes underneath the bridge. I think it's via the bike trail.
Yes.
So they argue that there was no negative impact to pedestrian safety. And then, were there any other points that they addressed in that presentation? Because their presentation was a bit shorter than the initial Appellate one.
Yeah, and I think to maybe expand on the kind of road argument a bit, I think the appellant was saying that, or they brought someone up who basically had a very detailed map of the roads and bike lanes and things like that, and their argument was that whatever the developer proposed in their plan could basically not physically be met by the dimensions of the road. So they were saying you need a 6-foot bike lane or something, but there's only so much space on the asphalt that is currently paved. So I think that's the only thing I would add, but that was pretty much.
So that was a lot of the back and forth. And then there was an opportunity for the public to comment, on which there was probably about a dozen people that spoke. There was a lot. There was one or two who were generally saying affordable housing is good, I support this project. But by and large,
I think the first person was in support, which was kind of I'm not gonna lie, it kind of threw me off, because I think I could sense the energy in the room that people were they had come out specifically for this issue, and I was sort of not ready for someone to just be in defense of it, right out of the gate.
Which, that being said, it was very quick.
It was very quick, yeah.
And then after that, it was person after person who really touched on different aspects or supported earlier speakers on why this project would be bad for the community. Some of the reasoning was that there are already areas of the city that were discussed in the previous agenda item that are already designated for low income and senior housing. And that the city is also currently above the threshold that's required by the state. So this project was, one, unnecessary, and two, it is less attractive than those other locations. So they presented that as an alternative, as well as suggested that the city instead incentivize those sites getting developed rather than this one. They really emphasized the fact that the land wasn't zoned for residential use and was instead that professional business as it is right now. They argued that there was no really viable way to mitigate those health and safety concerns, especially I think the safety one with traffic has been something that was very consistently brought up. There was a little bit of a heated back and forth of accusations of personally they are lying to you versus the other side's lying to you. But largely it stayed on the issues.
I don't think a ton of it devolved into an ad hominem thing. I think if I had to guess, a lot of it was sort of an animosity for developers in general. I think it wasn't specifically targeted at that one person. And I think the converse was this idea that actually I really don't know what the converse ad hominem argument was. I think it was just the developer was basically arguing that hey, you just don't like this project and you just don't want it to go through, and all of these arguments that you're making are just a sort of veiled attempt to tell the city council in a roundabout way that you don't like this project.
And I think the one way where it kind of blended whether or not it was substantive versus an ad hominem was there was a specific speaker that was included in the initial presentation who the developer objected to speaking, and I guess filed some sort of formal complaint about it, because the developer asserted that they didn't pay a fee and didn't really have a place to be speaking as part of that process. That one is really tricky to say to what extent there's legal ground for that. Frankly, I don't think we're qualified to even talk about that. So
yeah,
we'll just mention it and leave it there.
yeah. I mean, that was a. I mean, it is interesting to get into these like kind of nuances because in a lot of these like. You know, I think a lot of the housing debate kind of glosses over this, right? You get stuck on this like high level point of like, okay, how do we build like more housing? Like, what's the supply chain for housing? Like workers and land allotments and things like that. But this is really the nitty gritty stuff which can make or break a development. It's not like we don't have the technology to like build apartments, right? Like this is we're not like going 0 to 1 here. Really, it's a lot of this, and it is good. We shouldn't just like steamroll over existing residents. I mean, because I think that's such a bad precedent. Because then, what if there is like some dense housing somewhere, and someone from like a single family zoning kind of coalition says like, hey, well, we want to steamroll this and build what we want, and on principle, I think the argument would be the same. So I think being empathetic to the existing constituents here probably pays big dividends in the long run in terms of like your credibility and your ability to do kind of larger and larger projects, or maybe even smaller projects more frequently.
Before we get into the final vote, I have a couple of process observations that I wanted to share. One thing that I think was interesting was the even though there were a lot of people in the community that still wanted to speak by the end of it, they ran out of the physical copies of the speaker cards.
Yes.
Which was interesting because it almost like I haven't been to enough city council meetings to know how regular this is, but it feels almost intentional.
Yeah.
Where it's a way to make sure that the public doesn't go on and on and on. I think that exists on the spectrum of whether or not the city council wants to maintain timeliness versus how much is going to be public participation and more of a democratic process. That's definitely a judgment call by whoever's in charge of that. But they also, that is related to, apparently there was a new rule the city council passed about no new business can be discussed after 10:30 at night. And we were very much coming on that 10:30 at night timing. So I have a feeling the two things are related because the timing worked out pretty well, and it's pretty strict on what speaking time you have once you get up to the podium.
Yeah, I believe it's the city manager who brought it up around like 10:15ish. Yeah. I will say though, it does seem like the two are separate to some extent, right? I think the rule was to not bring up any new topics. Yeah. But I think if there are more cards, obviously people could speak on the same topic, sort of on and on. And so you're right. It's kind of a tricky thing. I would like some sort of electronic like voting system. Maybe you get like maybe there's like a one-time or a unique passcode per city council meeting that you only get by attending physically, and then that code basically gives you access to like submit it was like a blue card basically, the speaker request.
Well, you can just do like a Google form, I feel like, at that point.
That's true, but I don't know. I think some people would have apprehensions about like security or what if like you send the link to someone and they like spam the Google form or something like that. So kind of building in some mitigations there. I mean, it's definitely a challenge. It's not like a walk in the park, but I think it would be worth it for the amount of public discourse because it clearly seemed like this was an issue that was hit very close to home for a lot of people.
No, literally.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I actually did not. No pun intended. But yeah.
Well, it's also interesting because there's not many city council meetings that it seems like people are really motivated to go out and speak.
Yeah.
So when they do, one would think that the process should like really help them speak and get their concerns out because it's not always an easy thing for people to go to city council. In this circumstance, the city council is very, very close to the housing project and very, very close to where it seems like a lot of these people live. So it wasn't necessarily super onerous to make the travel. That being said, particularly in bigger cities, and this is going beyond Folsom, the ability to go to a city council meeting, especially if you work at night or have other responsibilities, and then like knowing when you're going to speak on the agenda, sometimes that can be kind of a lot of an investment for a 3-minute speaking slot. So it seems like you could potentially alienate some of the people that are coming to participate publicly in democracy.
Yeah, exactly. And we were definitely some of the few young people that I could see there. And I think it would just be way better if there was more representation. But again, like to your point, maybe young people like us are students, or maybe they're working late, or they have young families, and so they require like a lot more attention. And so
it's also on a Tuesday night, so I mean, most people have something to do Wednesday morning.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I actually noticed in like the when I subscribed to that Folsom newsletter was that I didn't know the mayor had like basically like office hours on like I think Tuesdays and Thursdays, but it's from like I want to say it's like 11 a.m. to like 3 p.m. or something. So I'm like, okay, this is quite inaccessible for.
Well, it makes sense because it's, you know, from their perspective, it's their working day.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I would say, like, you know, if you're having like office hours, I don't know. I feel like it would behoove you to make it as widely accessible as possible if you really want to be representative of your constituents. Now, that being said, because we're moving to a district-based election system, you know, maybe the mayor. Actually, does the mayor get elected citywide, or is that part of a district? Or are they like a council member? That's actually something I don't really know.
Yeah, so as the system currently works, the district-based election was another mandate by the state, and that was something that recently happened. And what basically the city is doing is they're staggering the way that they're doing it. So the 3 seats, I want to say the odd districts, were elected last election, which had a city council election, whereas before everyone was at large. And then this upcoming election in 24, that's going to be where the other 2 seats are, which currently are occupied by the mayor and vice mayor. Those are going to be for the corresponding to the even districts. Because the mayor position, we live in a weak mayor system where it rotates among the city council members. I'm fairly confident it's not going to be an at-large election.
Oh, gotcha.
I do think, like, Darvesh and I were definitely speculating during. I have a lot to say about the district-based election system. I think it would be interesting to have a mayoral election separate that is at large, because you ideally want your chief representative at the city level to represent all people rather than just
even if they only have like 1 vote, basically.
Yeah, but another observation that we had about the district-based elections is, particularly for a housing project like this, is very interesting, because if you alienate your constituents in a very specific region, potentially you only put pressure on 1 corresponding council member. So, for example, this happened in District 2. Yeah, this project...
It was like right at the edge of District 2.
Yeah, between 2 and 1, but on the 2 side. Really, the person who's going to be running for election in District 2, from a process standpoint, is going to feel the most pressure to vote a certain way, because these are their constituents, versus every other council member isn't really... Their votes aren't going to be affected by this vote, more or less, because it doesn't really... The project's not in their districts.
Yeah.
So that was a very interesting aspect of district-based elections, which I wonder how common of a thing that is. But I know we didn't address that in our previous video talking about that, so wanted to throw it out there now.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Do you want to move on to the final decision and kind of our like thoughts on the council members' arguments and questions and things like that? Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to
I think so. The final vote was a. Okay, so I'll try to be as clear as I can, because it is a very confusing what the vote was about, right? So it basically won 4-1 in that the appeal did not move forward.
So the no's were to the appeal. So if you voted no, it was to continue the project.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
it's like a double negative.
Yeah. So, but like, long story short, the the apartment complexes are going forward.
Yes.
That the residences, or whoever the resident was of that area, their appeal did not move forward in the process. But you know, I felt like some of the arguments were pretty interesting, and the most interesting argument that I heard, which I felt like was, it felt very politically salient, in that a lot of the council members kind of framed it as, hey, look, you know, if it were just up to me, or if it were just up to us, you know, we would totally block this project, because clearly this isn't an issue for you. However, you know, the state has these very onerous demands, and these demands are gonna, you know, kind of accumulate over time, right? These housing projects take like a very long time. So if you're in, you know, a deficit for your housing element for a while, you know, that leaves a very wide window of opportunity for developers to make, you know, even more projects sort of unscrupulously. And so I found that framing actually quite interesting, which is that they're saying like, hey, you know, it's like, it's not up to me, my hands are tied, you know, I'm sort of being forced to do this, and so I'm really on your side ideologically, but you know, via the process I actually have to appeal to the developer in this instance.
Legal counsel was also part of this meeting, and they were mentioning a lot of the same arguments. They were very much supporting that frame of thinking for the city council, and there was more back and forth with them, because this is such a tricky legal issue than in previous meetings.
Yeah. Also, one thing I wanted to address of like a previous point. So one of the claims made by the appellant was that, we are in a surplus with respect to our housing element, and so this development is kind of superfluous. And the counter argument to that from the developer was that the property was actually purchased back in October of 2021. So at that time, the assessment was that there were more housing projects that were needed in order to meet the criteria for sufficient low-income housing and just sufficient housing in general for the housing element that Folsom was going to propose. So I thought that was kind of interesting because initially I was actually like, oh wow, yeah, I mean, if this project is kind of superfluous, I mean that is a really good point.
Yeah.
But I didn't really take into account the enormous latency that these projects can have, because there's a huge process in so there's also CEQA, which is like I forget what the exact acronym is, but it's basically like an environmental assessment of the land, and to make sure that whatever development you're doing on there is not kind of sufficiently or is not significantly disturbing the kind of natural environment, not just like noise pollution wise and stuff, but like actual like the soil, the water, etc.
So yeah, I'll just say CEQA stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. It was passed way back in the Reagan administration when he was just governor of California before he was president. Basically, it's a bunch of requirements saying that you have to do an environmental assessment of what your proposed project is going to do to the local environment. And then that also speaks to like how long of a process this is for a developer to build. They have to go through CEQA, they have to do the traffic assessment, then they have to go through the planning commission process to get the project approval. So it's definitely been in the works for a while.
Yeah. Interesting. I actually didn't know that CEQA encompassed like all of those things. So it seems quite holistic in terms of like it's using the word quality quite liberally.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. It used to be very easy to sue under CEQA housing project, but I think that's why the HAA, I want to say it was like Housing Affordability Act that was passed last year.
Housing Accountability Act.
Yeah, Housing Accountability Act. That is one of the motivations behind the bill to kind of counter that.
Without actually like repealing the bill, because I imagine the CEQA probably has some positive externalities, right? Like you're making some like chemicals processing plant or something like that. Like
the process still has to be gone through.
Yeah.
Like there still has to be an environmental impact assessment. Unless there's some reason to say that there's not going to be like any harm to the environment, but at the end of the day, that's still a consideration.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think we pretty much ran through all of the arguments. Are there any final points that you want to make?
No. I think it was very clear that this was a hard decision for the city council members to make. I think it would be hard for anyone in these positions to make, especially given that so many people from the community came out to like have such personal like stories and these deep-rooted concerns about this housing project. So at the end of the day, I think resting on that legal argument was probably, it made the most sense why the city council voted the way it did because of that. But I have a feeling that this is an issue that's still going to be sitting with a lot of the members of the community.
Yeah, and maybe one silver lining that I took from this personally was that that a small focused group of residents can actually have a very outsized impact. Right, like Folsom is maybe like 70,000, 80,000 people, and there maybe only a couple dozen people there, and maybe like half of them actually spoke. So it just goes to show you, right? Like if you're in Folsom, like, come out to the city council meetings. If you're living in a neighboring area, I mean even wherever you're living, right? Like if you try to participate, that you'd be surprised like how invested people can get. And also, I guess just like be patient, right? That this is definitely not the first city council meeting that we went to. Most of them are pretty mundane, right? There's some kind of back and forth. A lot of it is kind of in the weeds and
procedural.
Procedural. Yeah, exactly. Like the council members adopting the budget that the city manager proposes, right? It's like a bit of a formality, and the real debate on the budget will happen later, but it still needs to happen.
I think adopting the meeting minutes from the last meeting is probably the most procedural because it's like, well, I mean, it's already been said.
Exactly. Yeah. It's already been recorded and everything. If you want to go to a city council meeting, I would implore you to do so. And but also don't be worried. Like don't expect to just like come into like a heated housing debate on like the first go. I mean, maybe you will. Who knows? Like.
That's how a lot of people get into it.
That's true. Actually, that's a good point.
Because otherwise, like, what issues are really drawing you out? They need to speak to you if you're the average citizen.
Yeah. It's exactly. And like your housing, like it's about as personal as it gets.
Yeah.
So I guess with that we'll wrap it up, and we'll keep you guys posted on if we interview any people, either from this whole process or kind of adjacent to it. This is one topic we really want to delve deeply into, and we think it would really benefit people to hear from people on the ground in these like hyper local sort of settings rather than these sort of broad sweeping things on county or state level. So yeah, I guess with that, see you guys next time.
See ya.
Cool. Awesome.
All right. How long was that?